Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cengiz Akbulut, and I would like to tell you a story. Today's story begins approximately 1.5 billion years ago on planet Earth. The planet was composed of one piece of land called Pangaea, and the ocean. And approximately 1.5 billion years ago, this one continent, Pangaea, began to separate. And on separation, it formed the continents which we know on this planet that we live in today. But while separating, something happened. You had many, many rocks falling into the ocean. And these rocks were composed of a bunch of different minerals. One mineral in particular, calcium. Now, this calcium influx, or calcification of the ocean that took place 1.5 billion years ago, really changed the chemical landscape of the ocean, where the only life forms were living at the time. So with this change, all the organisms in the ocean had to adapt. And with this adaptation came a spurge in evolution, and which approximately took place 500 million years ago, and is known as the Cambrian evolution. Now, we're talking billions of years, millions of years. So if we were to take the entirety of time from planet Earth, that's as one day, so 24 hours, humans have been around for approximately 77 seconds. Of which recorded history is 2.5 seconds. It just passed. Relatively insignificant in the big scheme of things, if you think about it. So, recorded history is something which is very recent. We're talking about 4,000, 5,000 years, and one of the first civilizations that were well studied, that have recorded a history, is ancient Egyptians. Yeah? So I'm from Britain, and the British were very good at looking into recorded history, and they were one of the first nations to do so. And one gentleman in particular, Mark Rufford, noted that in particular mummies, that they had these really hard blood vessels. And this is the earliest known cases of cardiovascular disease. Now, he had to go about digging through these mummies, whereas nowadays you can just do a CT scan and have a look at it. And I'd like to read you a little extract from his paper in 1911, which I think was quite inspiring. The mud, sand, bandages, and gummy material are first picked out with forceps, or slowly scraped away, a most unpleasant task, as the dust floating in thick clouds about the room is most irritating to the lungs. Now that's science, that's research, that's adventure. That's something which I think is really, really cool. So what about these hard blood vessels? So with these blood vessels, you have a muscle cell inside them, called a smooth muscle cell. This contracts and relaxes to enable blood flow. However, during the course of one's life, these muscle cells can change job. And this is what happens in disease state. So instead of thinking, I'm a muscle cell, they think, I am a bone cell. Why? This is something which is what I study. So I studied at the University of Aberdeen between 2009 and 2013. I used to look like this. And for those of you who don't know, Aberdeen is the 5th oldest university in the UK. It was founded in 1495, and with it being an old university, it has particular traditions about it. So I studied a degree in biochemistry at the School of Medical Sciences. And with it being an older university with particular traditions, everything rested on my final year of my degree, which maybe is quite similar to some other people's degree programs. So I had 30%, which came from a bunch of essays and doing my thesis. And then 70% rested on 5 exams. These 5 exams were to take place on a Wednesday, a Friday, a Monday, a Wednesday, and a Friday. So in preparation, I was preparing for my exams. And here came the big week, the first week to start. Monday morning, I'm awoken by a phone call from my mother. My mother has this particular soft tone about her. And she informs me that during the night, my grandma, in fact, had passed away. And Aberdeen University had this fit-to-sit policy, so that I either had to do all 5 exams then, or not do them at all and wait a year. And I knew my grandma wouldn't want this. And we came from a Muslim family, so one thing which we do is we go about immediate burials. But because I had my exams and I was in North Scotland, she was in London, and my family who live elsewhere, we decided to do the funeral on a Saturday. So I prepared for this. I did my exam on a Wednesday, on a Friday. After the exam on Friday, went home, dropped my stuff off, went to Aberdeen Airport, flew down to London. On Saturday, we said goodbye to my grandma. Then on Sunday, I got a train ride up to Aberdeen, where I studied on the train. And if you've ever got the train before from London to Aberdeen, it's actually a really nice journey. I recommend you do it. There's a little piece between Newcastle and Edinburgh, which is fantastic. You have North Sea on your side, as well as hanging cliffs and green fields. It's really spectacular. Highly recommend it. But yeah, then I went on. Yeah. So I said goodbye to my grandma. My grandma was an amazing woman. She was a true matriarch. You know, like my granddad was, he had his issues. He had something like an undiagnosed PTSD because of his time in the police force. And yeah, my grandma was the strong one who really held the family together. And I loved her. She was actually born in Cyprus in 1918. She married my grandfather is about when she was in her early 20s. I don't know the years exact. And my family moved over to the UK in 1959 because of my granddad. So he was a police officer for the British Commonwealth. And my understanding is he wasn't just a police officer, but he was quite good. He was so good that, in fact, there were several assassination attempts on his life made by an organization called AOCA, who wanted to promote enosis, which is something for another day. So what happened in 1959 is that one day my granddad came home from work and said to my grandma, if we want, I have early retirement and we can go to London. They had a couple days to think about it, but they didn't tell anyone because of the nature of what was happening. And they decided to go for it. And then in the middle of the night, my mom and her family, so that's my grandparents and their 5 kids, went to an airport, left Cyprus, went to London. My granddad never returned. My grandma a couple times in the 1960s. That was about it. And then my family's moved to London, which was, you know, fantastic for me. That's kind of leads us to where we are today. So I went to London to say goodbye to my grandma in the middle of my exams, and somehow I passed. I was over the moon, absolutely over the moon. And I continued into academia. I went on to do a master's in regenerative medicine at the University of London, Queen Mary. And there were 2 particular stories from that, research stories, which I find absolutely fascinating. The first one was by this experiment by this guy called John Gordon in 1961, where he took a total of 726 cells from the intestine of a frog, and he removed the nucleus, and he transplanted that into an enucleated egg. So that is an egg which has not been fertilized. And from these 726, 10 formed a viable life form. How cool? How cool? The next experiments, which really got me during my master's, was by a guy called Shinya Yamanaka in 2007 published, where they looked at what genes or what chemicals were really high in embryonic stem cells, so that's the first cell that's created from when a sperm goes into an egg. And then they gave these chemicals to a mature cell, to a skin cell. And amazingly, these cells had the hands of time turned back on them. And I thought that was super cool. These 2 experiments, not only did I think they were cool, but in fact the international community of scientists also thought that they were really cool. And these guys were both awarded a joint Nobel Prize in Medicine and Physiology in 2012 for their work to show that every cell in anyone's body holds the secrets to life. And I thought that was really cool. Really cool. So what about me? What do I do? So I actually use Shinya Yamanaka's method in order to study vascular calcification, the earliest known the earliest known disease to have inflicted mankind. And how I do that is I start off by taking blood samples from a patient. I can take the blood out of a patient, and then I do some magic, and I turn them into more of one type of blood cell. Then I use the Yamanaka factors, as they're called, in order to turn the hands of time back on these cells. And when I do that, I then have an endless supply of pluripotent stem cells specific for this patient. Now what I do after that is I go about turning these stem cells into vascular cells. And I do this by a combination of factors and magic, and with that, I then get out cells which are specific for the smooth, which are smooth muscle cells. So this is the cell type that is in our blood vessel, that contracts and relaxes to enable blood flow, but when in a diseased state, can form bone-like material. And that's my research. That's what I look into, what happens on a chemical level using these models. So I'm 1.5 years into my PhD, and the story continues. Please follow me on LinkedIn, or also you can follow the Intricare on our Facebook page, Twitter, check it out. And yeah, I think I see where the research goes. I think there's a lot of potential, and I look forward to telling you more about it. And so if I was to conclude my talk now in the fashion of the Ig Nobel Prize, which is something like the Nobel Prize, but a bit goofy, is they do a 7-word summary. And my 7-word summary of my research is that I'm changing cells to see why cells change. Thank you.